Ron, it is such an honor to have you on Noise to Signal interview series. But one thing that rarely gets talked about is the culture that you created in the early days of Tenable. I want to start the interview there.
Right, I was surrounded by great people. So my wife, Cyndi Gula, Jack Hufford, Renaud, Deraison, they all brought a lot of different perspectives about how to take care of people. The CEO's job is to remove barriers for their employees, whether they need a tool, a policy change.
And one person that shows up extensively in your interview series is Veron. And Veron is the virtual Ron. I'm curious if Veron is the Larry David version of real Ron from Curb Your Enthusiasm.
I wanted to do sort of a Joe Rogan podcast. I really can't say that I have a founder who did a really bad job on a panel, and here's how we should all listen to it. Right? So I found out I can do animation with characters. The Pope just came out with an AI ethics thing. I read the first half of it. I'm like, this is great. Go write a script on this.
When Tenable did its first Series A, it was a 50 million Series A.
And when we raised those rounds, the $50 million round, the $300 million round, not only were they record setting at the time, but they were direct secondary sales. And what that meant is that money went to the employees. With AI, what I'm telling people, whatever you do is almost irrelevant because you can make it with AI. So it's more important to engage your customer.
One of your best or most prominent videos is the 5-slide pitch deck.
We did it a little bit out of frustration because we would get pitches from companies and we couldn't tell if it was a nonprofit or a commercial company, right? You might be building a great product, but you're dependent upon that AI. Who's got the real innovation there? Who's got the intellectual property?
Do you think the AI transformation is similar compared to the cloud?
Absolutely.
How do startups build moats in the age of AI? What is the future of jobs with AI?
What I'm saying is if you're a CISO, you should be fighting to run any AI initiative you have in your company. If you're not lobbying for that role, you're going to be out of a job.
Let's talk about the future of cyber offense and cyber defense.
And what that means in the age of AI, I think it means a couple things. So what do you do?
What's the next big video dropping from Veron?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ron Gula, co-founder of Tenable and CEO at Gula Tech Adventures.
We are live. Ron, it's such an honor to have you on Noise to Signal interview series. You have been a founder, you've been an investor, you have been a board member, you've been a philanthropist, you've been a mentor and a coach for hundreds of startups. And you talk extensively about your early days at Tenable. One thing, as I was preparing for this interview, I've been listening to a lot of your interviews, and you talk extensively about your early days of how you created Tenable, the journey of Tenable, and so on and so forth. But one thing that rarely gets talked about is the culture that you created in the early days of Tenable. And as an employee, I experienced it at Tenable. And so I want to start the interview there. This was your second startup, if I'm correct. And I'm curious if the early culture of Tenable, was it organic or was it intentional the way you did it? Because there are two anecdotes I want to share from my perspective, but I want to get started with the way you created Tenable in the early days, the way we experienced it. What was your thinking behind the culture that you created at Tenable?
Well, hey, it's a pleasure to be on the Noise to Signal podcast. Very proud of what you've done, after Tenable as well. I wish you a whole lot of luck with your new startup. But
thank you.
But look, the culture of Tenable, I got lucky, right? I was surrounded by great people. So my wife, Cyndi Gula, Jack Hufford, Renaud, Deraison, they all brought a lot of different perspectives about how to take care of people, how to have a culture, how to grow things. But I got to tell you, I was in the Air Force. I got to experience leadership and command from a lot of different things. And I kind of said, I don't really like that. I kind of like this. I don't really like that. I kind of like this. And then, I got to go to the NSA and again, see different leadership styles, that some things I liked and I didn't like. And as we went through the career, Cyndi and I had the benefit of starting a smaller company, Network Security Wizards, that made the Dragon IDS. And that was over a pizza shop, and we eventually sold that. So a lot of this, how do you take care of people when the product's, selling and bringing stuff in? We were very, very lucky that we always made products that people wanted. And they say, you can't, products don't sell themselves, but when you're making money from customers, you can put the customers on a pedestal and basically enable your employees to support the customer. And there's a big trust factor there. So, today in 2026, some of the things we were doing in the early 2000s, I think a lot of companies do, taking people to the movies, during work hours, for example, doing an all hands meeting with everybody. And, today with so many remote people after COVID, it's tough, but you mentioned a couple of things, Cyndi and I, we would get the donuts and the visibility of seeing us carry that stuff in. I think people say, leader servant, all that kind of stuff, but we really tried to just kind of
You
make sure
both
that the
lived that. You
employees.
both lived that philosophy. And I think the thing I want to say is you and Cyndi were a great combination. And I say this with all the love because you were much more, Cyndi was very strict. So I don't know if this is like a bad cop, good cop kind of thing, where Cyndi was the most warm motherly figure that you could have in the office, but she would also be very strict. Right? She would always be strict, and you would always be very open. Your office door was always open. You could always walk in. Hey, Ron, I just had a great idea. So it was a great combination. And there are two things that I want to share. And as you said, right, we would have this breakfast, Friday breakfast. We would have Thursday lunches. Everyone was in the office room in the cafeteria having lunch, and we would share stories and whatnot. But I want to share like two stories from my days at Tenable and how I experienced it as an employee. And this was like the worst time in the from an economic point of view. It was 2008. The mortgage crisis was in full bloom, and all the companies were firing people left and right. I was still very new to the company, and my wife had gotten residency in New York. So I was essentially traveling back and forth. Friday evenings, I would drive to New York, and then Monday mornings, I would come back. I would drive down. And obviously, some days I would get late for the early first Monday morning meetings. I would my eyes would be red, bags under my eyes. And
I thought
obviously,
you were just coding,
yeah. So, there was a sense of fear that, hey, I don't want to tell this because people might perceive this. Hey, maybe he's going to New York. So I didn't tell this to anybody. But the word got out and you came to know about it. You came to know about it that Mule has been traveling up and down every weekend. He's been doing all these things. And then one fine day, I get a tap on my desk from you. And it's a Friday, you get a tap. Hey, I just listened. I just heard that you've been traveling up and down. And I'm like, my heart is a bit throbbing. Like, what the hell? Like, it's a Friday. What's going to happen? And you come and tell me, hi, do you want to work 4 days a week? Just work an hour, 2 hours every day more and just take Friday off. And I was just blown away by it because here's a CEO. He comes to I was a very junior engineer. He comes to me, hey, I just heard about something that's happening. I was like, it was very impactful in that moment, in that crisis. Because if it was, if it was a normal time, no one would have cared. But this is like everyone was laying off people. But here is a CEO like, hey, my employees are struggling. Let me see if I can do something. And so I didn't take you up on the offer, but it was very impactful. And so this is like from for a leader taking care of the employee. The second aspect I want to share is this is before this incident, but you would tag me along for these dinners with prospects, right? I was single. I was not doing anything in the evenings. You would come, hey, Mio, what you doing for dinner tonight? I'm like, nothing. And you would take me to these prospect dinners. And this was the time when we were selling $1,200 Nessus feeds. We were selling $1,200 Nessus feeds. That was my majority of our business. And there was this prospect who was convinced he has to buy a passive vulnerability scanner. And I don't know why. And it was probably a $10,000, $15,000 deal. Not a big deal, but maybe, 10 Nessus subscription. So this is significant enough for us to, warrant attention. And the guy was convinced that he needs to buy PBS. And you realized for whatever reason that he doesn't need PBS. I think whatever he had is good enough. He doesn't need to buy PBS. And the guy kept, and during the dinner, the guy kept convincing you, hey, I need to buy this. And you're like, no, you don't need to buy it. And I, as an employee, was wondering, should I just jump in and say, hey, we'll take the deal. Let's have dinner and then go. But the point I want to make is you also didn't, like, one is you obviously took care of the employees and the culture, but then you were also very, you're not trying to sell things customers didn't need. So you're also very customer focused in the sense that you are not trying to get more money. If there was a genuine need, you would sell everything and anything they would want. But like both these incidents were very spoke a lot about your character and the company that you are building. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, I appreciate bringing up both of those stories. And look, I'm just going to say, look, I was lucky, right? I was surrounded by really good people. We had enough revenue from customers that we didn't have the stress of having to fundraise, and we're still managed cash flow and stuff like that. But basically, when you talk about giving you a day off or working fours, that kind of thing in the early 2000s, that was like progressive stuff that's very modern right now, especially after COVID. So things have really, really changed. But the CEO's job is to remove barriers for their employees, whether they need a tool, a policy change, something like that. And it's so hard. I mean, I think back in the day, we were 200 people, which you could get everybody into one room at that point. But as soon as we got
I
to
remember going to
300,
a movie theater for an all hands meeting. I don't know if you remember that. We booked the whole thing and then everyone was in there.
and we really tried. So for example, when we went on these sales calls, typically you go with a salesperson. If you're going to bring the CEO in, there's probably a salesperson who set that up. And I always had a policy that most of our research team, the people who wrote the vulnerability plugins and stuff like that, they were very distributed. So Renaud was always super concerned about, how do you get culture with these guys? How do you get them together? So we did some, all hands with those kind of things. But I always made a point, if I was doing a sales call in St. Louis, who from Tenable was there? Is it somebody in support, somebody in Brigham to meet a customer, right? So that was very, very important to me. And on the other hand, we talk about selling stuff to customers. And of course, we invented so many things at Tenable, right? If you look at the career of just having to span from scanning a network all the way to auditing SaaS and cloud apps. And, of course, Tenable's continued that with AI auditing now and whatnot. But every year there was a new technology. So the question is, what do the customers actually need? And I felt like Willy Wonka, like we were coming up with so many things that were ahead of that curve. And I think you were right saying, look, the customer probably needs more coverage. We had a major customer that didn't buy. And so you mentioned the passive vulnerability scanner. So imagine, for people who don't know this, a sniffer, like a network intrusion detection system that gives you vulnerabilities. It's real time, no impact to your network, that sort of thing. And that can be a political problem, because if your job is to scan for PCI violations or federal regulations and a sniffer can find it in real time, boy, that could be a big problem. That might have been the reason I was holding back a little bit on this guy. But yeah, it's great to have things that people want and try to sell that, but the customer comes first. That's why the whole thing is we had such a good time with the customers.
I'm curious, I never experienced any turbulence at Tenable in the early days. Was it always like that, or was it always smooth sailing, or were there scenarios where Tenable would not make
Yeah,
it?
so like now, Gula Tech Adventures, we're involved in almost 50 companies more, because we're also involved with funds who invest in companies, and we're kind of entangled with those things. So we can easily say we touch 100 companies. So we've seen amazing success with poor CEOs. We've seen our founders. We've seen great founders that we think are great have poor success. So there's really no way to predict those kind of things. But for Tenable in particular, we had great success. And, I don't think I ever got angry and yelled at anybody. We had to terminate people who didn't, perform. And I always felt we were slow to kind of make those changes in hindsight. But it was, I was pretty happy with the culture and doing things. And look, we still live in Columbia, close to the Tenable headquarters. So we'll run into people who are there, and we hear about the culture and the effect. And, Amit Yaran, God rest his soul, is doing a good job of maintaining that. Steve Vince is doing a good job. He was there, seeing those kind of things. So the point is it's kind of hard to put your finger on what culture really is, but man, we got lucky with hiring good people.
Awesome. And Ron, as I was preparing for this interview, I obviously listened to a lot of your interviews. And one person that shows up extensively in your interview series is Viron. And Viron is the virtual Ron. And you obviously you are a very prominent public figure in cybersecurity. You have a lot of thoughts you want to share, but you cannot share because you're public. You have a public profile. I'm curious if Viron is the Larry David version of real Ron from Curb Your Enthusiasm, because Viron is unfiltered. So I'm curious, what is the thinking behind Viron? And uh, yeah, I would just start there.
So, during COVID, I wanted to do sort of a Joe Rogan podcast with,
Okay.
people around the table, in person, microphones, and we did a lot of those. I think I did maybe 50 of those interviews. And I
Okay.
got some fairly senior cyber people from, DHS on the show, Cyber Command, and it's interesting. But, what happened is I'm going to say I got briefed on the typhoons before they were kind of public. This was really just China hacking into routers. And I wanted to visualize that. And this was before you can just go to a prompt and say,
Yeah.
show packets flying around from China and stuff like that. So I taught myself 3D animation. And we also do a lot of videos on entrepreneurs, how to give advice for startups. And I was like, oh, I really can't say that I have a founder who did a really bad job on a panel and here's how we should all listen to it. Or I would never do that. But at the same time, if I say I was at this conference and I saw this panel, it's pretty easy to kind of triangulate who I'm talking about in our portfolio. And believe me, that's a private conversation I want to have, but I'm also trying to be public about it. So I found out I can do animation with characters. I did a bunch of animations. And if you go back to like the early videos, it really looks like early Pixar type stuff, right? So I was learning how to do animation and stuff. But the animation technology has progressed so much.
Right. Yeah.
I created this Viron character that I can literally, like right now, I've got Claude working on 4 or 5 scripts for Viron. The Pope just came out with an AI ethics thing. I read the first half of it. I'm like, this is great. Go write a script on this, make all the imagery, do that kind of stuff. So could I do that in person? I could. But I'm really getting a following with the Viron stuff. And then for the stuff that I can't really talk about, for example, you did a great interview with Brian Martin, right? The vulnerability historian, right?
Yeah.
It's really hard for me to come up and just basically say, CIS is not doing a great job, or the White House is not doing a great job, or this policy should have been here. But putting it in animation, it appeals to more people. And I can also do comedy with it. I have a comedy guy called Gary Sinfeld. He can do humor, whether it's people like Canvas getting hacked during finals week. That's the kind of stuff I can do from a humoristic point of view. That's not me pointing the finger, still kind of raising awareness of this stuff. So I'm finding a great deal of enjoyment and following using the 3D animation. Plus, it gives me firsthand experience working with AI. What can it do and what can it do? How good can it go on? So yes, I appreciate you bringing Viron up. I thought about a way to bring him on this show, but the technology's not there yet. It's coming.
Hi, Ron. I heard you talking about me.
Hey, Viron, go back into the cloud. You are not needed for this interview.
No, but when I listened to the Brian Martin's analysis interview, I was like, whoa, who is this? Is this Ron saying this, or is this Ron, right? And I'm curious, do you prompt it in a certain way to guide it? These are my opinions, and
I absolutely. So, like for example, the Pope being Catholic, I'm going to read that script very, very, very thoroughly before I even try to record it. Whereas, for example, with your interview with Brian Martin, I wanted to get the best, most controversial stuff and make sure that Viron wasn't like saying, this is good, this is bad. It was he's just factual saying, this is what Brian Martin said on the interview. And, kind of leaving it at that. And it gives me a lot of ability to kind of just put that information out there. At the same time, when the White House comes out with a executive order or a finding about, what they're dealing with China and stuff like that, I can also use Viron to do that and not necessarily look like I'm politically supportive of this administration or the previous administration. I really just try to be independent and doing that sort of stuff. So it gives me a lot of latitude to
Have
go
you
and test content and put content out.
have you gotten pushback for some of the commentary from here on, or is it like always free?
No, the only, I mean, look, if you ever have a channel, don't read your comments, right? There's always somebody who's saying this or saying that. Look, AI polls lower than the White House does right now. Like people are very concerned because I'll get, for a video that gets like 100,000 views, I'll get a shut up clanker comment, something along those lines. And I think that's funny. I really feel like I can, also experience what people are experiencing because some people just don't trust AI. They think it's going to take their jobs. They think it could be full of errors and stuff like that. So it's again, that from a social point of view, it's a really interesting thing to get involved in.
I get it. So, Ron, let's switch to your time post Tenable. You've been in one of your biggest contributions post Tenable is venture investing, coaching, mentoring startups. I remember when Tenable did its first Series A, it was a 50 million Series A, one of the biggest Series A at that time. And I remember you were bootstrapped for almost a decade or so. Tenable didn't take any venture money in those days to the extent possible. I'm curious but now 50 million Series A is not a big deal. But in those days, it was probably the top 10 venture Series A deals of that time. But now Series A, like Tenable probably had thousands of customers and millions of dollars in ARR before it got to 50 million Series A. But now you could have sub 1 million ARR and still get a 50 million Series A, or sometimes even 100 million Series A. You just put an AI on top of your company, and you're like, boom! I don't know if you saw the shoe company, the Allbirds. They went and they put AI in their name, and it went off. I'm curious, given your deep experience in venture post Tenable, how has that business changed from your point of view, the way you see it?
Yeah, so a couple comments there. So Tenable, we were extremely successful with generating revenue, supporting customers, just hitting the market at the right time. And when we raised those rounds, the $50 million round, the $300 million round, not only were they record setting at the time, but they were direct secondary sales. And what that meant is that money went to the employees. Typically today, if you're a million ARR and you see a headline, hey, somebody raised $20, $30 million, that goes on to the balance sheet of the company, right? There might be a little bit of secondary sales for the founders, maybe some key people. But with those rounds, we had that experience of bringing employees into a room and saying, this is what's happened. You might have enough stock to buy a house, pay off your student loans, become a millionaire, right? We had a range of people that were doing that, and very, very, very unique. And with that experience, when I talk to founders, when I talk to startups, I'm always imagining, how is this company going to exit? Is the founder prepared for the financial management of becoming a millionaire? Are they prepared to guide their employees to do that? It's really tough because if you're a crappy founder and you're just greedy and you have a lot of equity and stuff like that, an option pool or something like that for your employees might not be that inspirational. But if you create a company that's worth, $500 million and the employees have 10 to 20% of that, if you include the founders and stuff, that's a significant amount of wealth creation. And a lot of founders kind of miss that opportunity to kind of say, there's ways to exit before, you're super, super successful, or before you have to raise 2 or 3 more rounds, right? When you see a company does a Series A, a Series B, a Series C, boy, maybe that company's great and they're making money and increasing value at every step of those ways. Maybe these are dilutive rounds. It's hard to say sometimes, what is going on with some of these companies. I'll give you, again, I can't name names, but there's a company.
Maybe a V-Ron episode.
Yeah, really. But look, there's a company we passed on. I said, you're never going to be able to raise. Within a week, they raised $30 million. And then guess what? 3 years later, revenue is still about less than $1 million ARR. I see that a lot in this industry. And that's the kind of thing I want founders to avoid, right? If you're raising $1, you better be putting that dollar to work and making at least $1 from your customers, right? Because if you can take a $20 million investment and turn it into $2 million of revenue, and you still need more money to pay for your company, that's not a successful business. And I'm always reminding people, put the customer first. You have to have a product that people want. And then look, today with AI, what I'm telling people, whatever you do is almost irrelevant because you can make it with AI. So it's more important to engage your customer, support the customer, perhaps even merge what you're doing with other people who have similar types of customers so you can create value. You can't use a prompt to create customers. And that's going to be the biggest thing differentiating startups now into the next couple of years. Does anybody really care about what you're doing? And that's kind of where we're at right now.
What happens, you bring up an interesting point in the sense that you can literally create anything you want, right? And, you could, there is a feeling, hey, I can cloud code my way out of this. And I've seen this in our discussions at Control as well. Hey, why can't I cloud code these things and so on and so forth? And the reason typically founders go and raise is because they need, they need to hire, they need to do sales, marketing, and so on and so forth. But a lot of these things could be automated, or the need for hiring is not as much. So the need for raising a bunch of capital is also not that much. So what happens in the age of AI? What is the role of the VC? The capital needs, unless you're like training big models, you obviously need a lot of capital, right? If you're building data centers, you need a lot of capital. But if you're building software, you probably don't need as much capital. And I've seen, like, even in the competitors in my space, to raising 40, 50, $30 million rounds. And why are you raising all that money? What are you going to do? Going back to your point, if you take a $30 million investment, you probably need to make 300 million, 400 million, or get to that scale. So what happens to this venture side of the business when the need for capital is not as high?
Yeah, so it's a great question, right? So, I have this thing called the 5-slide pitch deck, right? What problem do you solve? How do you solve it? Show me some proof. What's your ask and what's your victory conditions, right? And we invest in a lot of different companies, right? Some people in our portfolio are primarily doing business with the Department of War. Some people in our portfolio are doing business with the consumers, right? People who have phones, there are apps on phones, that sort of thing. So the go-to-market is very, very different for those things. The ask might be, gee, we need to do a lot of marketing to push our app, our thing on this consumer thing, like the Apple iPhone mark, that kind of stuff. Maybe the ask is, look, we have a great product. We really need a human sales force. Maybe the ask is, hey, we actually have a lot of engineers, but they haven't been using AI. We need to transform this process into an AI first, engineering teams. I'm seeing all sorts of changes going across out there. We have a company in our portfolio. Again, I don't really want to say. They were doing a lot of what I would consider services, and they had a wide variety of scripts that were used in these services. And now they are bringing all that into a unified kind of SaaS platform. That's, could they do that with their budget? Do they need to raise? In this case, they're doing it within their budget, their cash flow. So they're fine. The other thing to think about is, coming out of COVID, coming out of some of the economic downturns we've had a couple of years after that, most companies, what I consider they're steady state. They're basically cash flow neutral. Maybe they're growing 10%, 20%. That's because they had to cut and do that. We have some of those companies in our portfolio. Most cyber funds have companies like that in their portfolio. What do you do in that case? My advice is like, look, you can raise, but maybe it's not at a term that you like. You have to give up too much of your company. So you need to do things to increase your revenue. One good example of that in our portfolio is we have a company called Threader, and they actually bought, the highest DNS security business. So now they can do inline blocking with a hardware device and secure DNS, which just, they got some customers with that. That is the model, what I tell companies who are trying to grow. Put your customers first, try to do M&A that's going to make you, a bigger base of customers, and offer something that complements your product.
On the topic of M&A, and maybe acquisitions, you have, listened to your interviews where you say you see these big numbers coming out. This so and so company got bought for 500 million or a billion, but the founders actually didn't make a bunch of money. It was essentially some kind of financial engineering that happened behind the scenes. And I see this all the time. There is a perversion of, there is a sense of perversion of capital in the sense that uh, the companies, like the companies that you built, like, product first, customer focused first, let's get to ARR, let's build a proper business, and then, get to a point or get to an IPO. I see less of that and more of hype. There's more of a lot of marketing hype. Hey, let's go and, get our pictures in front of NASDAQ and, and make a very splashy news event, and then it get acquired for 400 million or 300 million. But it is essentially the money is just exchanging hands between investors rather than the founders or building a proper company. And my co-founder Sasan experienced this at CrowdStrike. He was doing a due diligence for a company, and he was the head of engineering and product. And he passed on. He said, "Hey guys, this product doesn't work, not functional. There is no way we can use it here." 2 weeks later, company bought for $300 million. Um, I don't know what you have to say on this, but you probably experienced this from your point of view as well, right? Do you
Yeah, so
see this
it's kind of
perversion?
hard to relate because most people are not founders. Most people have not done what you've done, which is you said, I'm going to take a risk, I'm going to start a company and do it. And as soon as you start a company, you could be on a track to sell the company for a headline amount, $100 million, $300 million, $30 million. It's crazy that you can do it. But the story is, look, 99.9% of the companies never get past $100 million in revenue. They either go out of business, they get acquired, they just can't grow. And so that's a really difficult, thing for people to get their eyes around. And if you're going to incentivize somebody at a company like that, you're also competing with Google and
Yes.
OpenAI. They're throwing around salaries big enough that if you gave somebody 1% of your company and they work for you for like 5 years and you're sold for $300 million, they might take home the same amount of money working at Google. So it's a really interesting thing. What's changed though is the advice. I used to tell entrepreneurs that, look, once you build a technology, before you build your business, you have an opportunity to sell. And that might be the maximum amount of money return that you will ever make for you and your employees. And it's just crazy because you might have no revenue yet, but if you have a unique, defendable set of intellectual property, a thing that's really hard for somebody to duplicate, somebody might buy you for a lot of money, where the founders might still own more than 50% of the company. You do a couple rounds of fundraising though, founders are diluted. Maybe you don't get the best deal going forward. Maybe you get this amazing deal. There's all sorts of stories out there with this. But with AI, I've said, look, whatever you're building right now, it's tough because somebody at Cisco, somebody at Microsoft, whoever these acquirers are, Checkpoint, whatever, somebody's going to be in there saying, I can build the same thing that could just give me 10 weeks, right? Give me whatever. And that's a tough, that kind of upsets that. So now my advice for founders, get some customers. Like you can't just have technology. You've got to have customers that are using it and paying for it and are happy for it.
Ron, you give a lot of advice on startups, and one of your best or most prominent videos is the 5-slide pitch deck. And you said, what problem are you solving? How are you solving it? What are you going to do with the money? What proof do you have? And then what's your vision for success? It's pretty straightforward, pretty self-explanatory and understood. But uh, uh, not many people are internalizing it, and they still, you probably even now see pitch decks that are all over the place, right? From your perspective, what are some of the common mistakes founders are making, even after I think you promoted this for over 4 or 5 years now. It has
Yeah, we did it a little bit out of frustration because we would get pitches from companies
yeah.
and we couldn't tell if it was a nonprofit or a commercial company, right? It's kind of fuzzy because at the time we were doing a lot of these competitive grants for cyber nonprofits, and you would see somebody who has a cyber training for maybe veterans, and we're like, is that a commercial company? Is that a nonprofit? It was you know, the big point of the 5-slide pitch deck was to get to a no or a yes as quickly as possible. Because a lot of these funds, people don't realize that when you're in a meeting and somebody says yes, somebody else at that company has to go tell your story. So if you've got 30 slides and they're telling a different story than what you're telling, it's probably not likely you're going to get a fundraise, from that company. Now, a lot of mistakes people do is they put other things in there, like they tell me how big the market is. They tell me that they've got 4 advisors on their team. Like those are details that are going to come out after,
Yeah.
there's a transaction, right? You don't need to lead with that, right? And then sometimes people are like I literally got, I don't want to say names, but I had a female CEO, founder who said, "Hey, so-and-so invested our company. Would you want to invest?" That's a tough, what do I do? Because if I say no, it might get back to the person who's a prominent person in the industry that didn't want to invest. But that's not a reason to invest in a company. You're putting me in a tough thing. And then the second thing is, oh, we just closed 3 customers. Do you want to meet us? It's like, I still don't know what problem they solve. Is it competitive with any of our portfolio companies? That sort of thing. So I need to know as much as possible before we even take a meeting. And it's the same across all the other funds. Like a lot of time people don't realize that most of these cyber funds, they talk to each other. And if somebody
Yeah.
passes on something,
Yeah.
it's not necessarily like you're blacklisted or whatever the right
Mhm.
phrase would be. It because somebody out there is going to want you to. This is one of the big things we started Gula Tech Adventures because Cyndi and I had invested in all these funds, and we had some opinions on what founders were investable and what markets were investable. Some of those companies didn't. Some of those VCs didn't like us, so we said, look, we should go start our own fund and do these things. So there's so much talent out there, but there's also a lot of people who can talk themselves out of or investing in a company.
And are you still seeing the same kind of mistakes that you saw in the early days of 5 slides pitch deck where the founders come in with hey, so and so invested in my company, you should still invest, or are there new kinds of problems that you're seeing? Because the thing I wanted to touch upon is because building companies in the age of AI is completely different, and you've talked about this in your interviews where, and the line that comes to mind is there is no easy exit.
Mm-hmm.
The age of AI, there is no easy exit in the age of AI. So I want to touch upon that aspect of it. Like, how does building in the age of AI change?
Yeah. So the big thing with the AI is if you're building your technology on AI, you might be building a great product, but you're dependent upon that AI. Who's got the real innovation there? Who's got the intellectual property? If you build a cyber product and you're talking to Claude, you're talking to Anthropic, talking to OpenAI, talking to Gemini, whatever you're talking to, if that is your core IP, you're more of an integrator than you are an innovator. And that really gets people frustrated. But we've seen this pattern with the cloud. So if you write your own, for example, your log analysis tool, your parsers, your whatever, they got to run somewhere. But if you build everything on Amazon to the point that you use all of their APIs, you might be able to come to market really quickly. I tend to think you're also an integrator. You're really dependent upon the pricing of Amazon, the fluctuations of Amazon, their technology decisions. And we've seen cyber companies that are all in on Amazon, and guess what? They're stuck there. They can't go to Google. They can't go on-prem because if you're going to get big, whatever your product does, you got to have an MCP interface for it. You have an API for it. So your GUI has to look nice. It's got to work in a container. It's got to work in an appliance. And by the way, if I'm a Amazon shop, I got to be able to move that to Azure. So you have to do all these things as a startup. It's really interesting to figure out that impact. I just, man, it's tough. I actually had a company pitch me. They claimed that they're doing an AI thing that's somehow better than Claude and Anthropic. But at the end of the day, they're wrapping Claude and Anthropic. So it's like even then you're still dependent upon these things. So again, what problem do you solve? How do you solve it? If you're leveraging AI to solve that, man, I don't know if that's an investable company. And that's controversial for a lot of people.
Do you think you mentioned the cloud transformation where companies went and integrated with Amazon and then they had to go with Azure and so on. Do you think the AI transformation is similar compared to the cloud transformation?
Absolutely. It's absolutely similar. And so look, if you're building your product and your engineering team is using Anthropic, using, Perplexity, you're using whatever, Cursor, whatever people are using. Look, that's great. At the end of the day, though, if your actual product, the thing you ship, is dependent on Anthropic for its core value, what's the barrier to entry for another company to come in and do that? So, and then how do we even value that, right? Because you're really a wrapper for Anthropic. If you're a wrapper for Anthropic, you're, like I said, you're an integrator. You can make money,
Mm.
but it's almost like you're in the services business. And that's kind of the way I look at it. Now, we've invested in some companies that are very dependent upon Anthropic to do certain things, but the people who are using that are doing things we haven't. They're very first. They're it's the first of their kind, kind of thing. So we have an animation company that's Powers VRON. They have so much IP on top of that. Yes, they're dependent upon Anthropic, but they're also dependent upon 1111 Labs for voice. They're dependent on other things for doing types of analytics. My point is, if you are a wrapper for multiple services, you can probably create value. And I've seen some companies do this in cyber. I'm seeing people do it in healthcare. We have a healthcare investment that's in stealth right now. They're doing some amazing stuff with their own technology and with Anthropic. So it's like what problem you solve, how do you solve it? It becomes very easy to say, hey, that's intellectual property that the customers are going to buy. And someday somebody might want to own it because it's very, very unique and hard to reproduce.
But Ron, the kinds of companies that will get created out of AI will, by design, be AI native. So, for example, when iPhone came out, that created the Ubers of the world. Without iPhone, Uber would not exist. So the new companies that come out, they have almost AI as a substrate layer, where the reasoning and the thinking, this was simply not possible before. Most of it was very rules based. You had to code every aspect of your business process and so on. So my sense is these kinds of companies, the new kinds of companies, AI native companies, they will get created built on this substrate. I mean, they could obviously be seen as a wrapper, but obviously they have to build their IP. My question is, how do you then expand? How do you then grow the companies in this AI native world? Is this because the historical model was land and expand? You land in with one product, one solution, one niche. You go in, I'm going to solve this for you. You get that, you make that customer happy, then you expand to the adjacent. What else can we do for you, and so on and so forth. So, is land and expand still a viable strategy for startups in the age of AI?
So I think it is. So the question really is, what problem are people solving? And when you mention AI, people are like, we need AI guardrails. Well, there's a lot of companies doing that. There's a huge gold rush of companies that are saying we can control or detect how you're using AI. My issue with a lot of these companies, we haven't invested in a lot of, we did some, I'll talk about that in a second. But my issue with a lot of these companies, there's so many ways to interact with AI. Trying to say you're detecting it all or stopping it all is really tough, right? Or if you have a BYOD computer, Microsoft might put Copilot right in that computer, right? Can I go to the web interface and interact with Gemini, in my private Gmail? There's so many different AIs that are out there. It's interesting. How do you want to detect it? How do you want to enforce it? One thing that's really interesting, though, is for people who write their own LLMs, it's a completely different conversation. Where was the data at? Is the data good? Is it clean? Is it sovereign? If we're going to spend $500,000 to train a new LLM, what happens if it comes out and we forgot to put this guardrail and we forgot to do something like that? So this type of interpretability, I think, is the future, because people don't really want to rely 100% on Anthropic for core decisions, right? They don't want to rely on OpenAI. Now some companies will, but if you're Citibank, maybe that's not good enough. You have to maybe train your own LLM. And this is a whole new world of doing things like that. We have an investment in a company called Starseer. They literally can take an LLM off a Hugging Face, make it faster, add guardrails, add that type of thing. And the technology is called the interpretability of that. Again, it's different than using AI and trying to police it versus creating an LLM and trying to change it after. But that's kind of how I see this industry right now.
Do you think for example, in cybersecurity, there's a lot of platformization. from an end user perspective, they either go to Palo or CrowdStrike or some of these big, and I think I see a parallel of that emerging, Anthropic, Gemini, and so on. So one way to look at this is all these platform companies will either bake that capability into their product. Like, this feature, whatever startup you're building becomes a feature in their product. So they buy it. Or the other way to look at this is a startup expands, does something new, expands, and then, builds the new platform that is going on. And I saw this in the CRMs of the world, right? Where you start with like one use case in the HubSpot, you start with one use case and then, you expand, and you serve a lot of these customers. Do you think do you think the platformization and the value concentration will go into like these big companies, or there is room for smaller companies to evolve and then make something successful out of it?
Yeah, so we did a couple of videos, live videos, not VRON, at the beginning of the year. And one of the things I talk about in sort of these predictions of what's going to happen over the next couple of years is indeed this platformatization, right? So one, everybody's going to do everything.
Yeah.
Now they're either going to be acquiring other people or they're going to be building it with AI. And, what does that mean? Well, is CrowdStrike going to be able to do vulnerability auditing? They already do a little bit. Can Tenable detect malware? Well, they've already been doing a little bit of that. It's going to get interesting to see what these companies do to expand what they do for customers. And this goes back to your land and expand that. But the second thing is like, look, this is a good thing. If you have a platform company, I don't care if you're Checkpoint, you're CrowdStrike, my favorite question to ask sales engineers is like, what percentage of the NIST cybersecurity framework do you cover with all of your products? And increasingly, it's like the answer is like 80%, 90%. And if you're an MDR, or an MSSP, it's 100% because, all of these services that you're offering are kind of interesting. So I think what's going to happen next is that you're going to have this ability for somebody to say, I not only have instrumented all of your network, but I can compare that to all these other customers I have. Checkpoint's got a lot of customers. Tenable does $1 billion in revenue, right? CrowdStrike's got a lot of customers. The point is that if you can instrument an enterprise, whether it's a small business, a large enterprise, with your platform, you can then really start making some decisions about what is a real threat? Do I have a control in place? Do I have compliance issues? And you can give that feedback to the CISO. And I think in some cases, if you put AI on top of that, you might replace the CISO. So I actually said, CISOs, watch your back. So my third prediction, I think these companies are going to come in and say, look, not only can we platform what you're doing, but we will do everything. We're going to make these decisions for you. And why? Because we've got AI, we've got all these customers and that sort of thing. So platformatization, even though it's going to look where the cyber industry is going to look like the auto industry in about 4 or 5 years, it's going to be a good experience for the customers. It might be a bad experience for people in cyber, because if they're not going to be needed at these companies, where do they go? Maybe they go to CrowdStrike. Maybe they go to these other MDRs, but we'll see what happens. That's where I think we're going as an industry.
If that is the case, how do startups build moats in the age of AI? Because you don't have the data, you don't have the customer.
They got to have customers. This is why I'm saying what you build is interesting and unique. That's cool. If you can't attract customers and grow your business, you're not going to be relevant. And that's why I say, look, if you do this niche thing, because that's one of the other issues with cyber. We've been around for a long time. There's new patching companies, like we're investors in Automox, but patching's been around for a long time. There's a lot of CI/CD companies out there. There's a lot of EDR, a lot of incident response companies, right? So if you're going to do something in that space, it becomes very niche. Like there's companies that they're starting to do incident response on phones. That's kind of cool. It's also very niche. There's not a lot of demand for that. So my point is, if you're going to do something, it's got to be defendable. It's got to have something that people want. You have to answer every one of those 5 slides pitch decks. If you can do that, you're probably going to be in good shape.
One thing you touched upon is the job of a CISO getting replaced by the service companies. My question is to you, what is the future of jobs with AI? Are we seeing a situation where service offerings will take out full-time jobs, even the CISO?
Yeah, look, the way I look at this, if you think about a smaller company and they want to be CMMC compliant, they go to a service like Drata, Vanta, or even like, look, we're an investor in an MSSP called BMO. BMO can get you CMMC certified if you're a Microsoft shop. They can do all the configurations. They can do all that. So is it as good as having somebody like, ReliaQuest or Arctic Wolf with your own SOC team looking at that? But look, if you're a 50-person company, working with BMO was probably state of the art for somebody of that size. But look, as you go up into small business, medium business, enterprise, large enterprise, Fortune 2000, Fortune 100, you're not going to have a one-click we're compliant. There's no way. So those people are always going to have something like a CISO that has to do with policy decisions about data flowing, data training, partnerships. There's so much to do at that scale of a company. We're never going to like not have a CISO at these Fortune 2000 companies. But look, when you go to these small companies, they don't have any cybersecurity right now. So they're probably going to have it outsourced to that. Somewhere in the middle, there's going to be conflict, right? Some people are going to be like, hey, instead of just outsourcing everything to this MSSP for monitoring or this MDR, why don't we do everything and reduce our staff? Maybe even get rid of the CISO. Like I really do see those questions happening right now.
So what do you recommend to the CISO who is in the CISO chair today? Should they take like a front seat for these AI decisions, or should
Well, look,
they?
I've always said, look, there's a lot of great CISOs out there. And for some businesses, if you have a huge, like there's some CISOs who have like 20 other field CISOs working for them. Like there's a large organizations, right? Aspiring to be the CISO there is probably your career goal of doing that. But if you're a small business and you're in IT, like I think you should be aspiring to be, the head of operations, even the CEO. Like sometimes security people know the business so well, they might be able to do marketing better. They might be able to do other things better. And I've always kind of felt bad that cyber people kind of say that the best job we can have is CISO. Boy, I think operations and CEO is a good job because if you're CISO, you got to touch everything. You got to touch marketing, legal, IT, budget. There's so many things that you have to touch in that business. How do our customers engage us? If all of that's happening and AI is controlling all of that, who better than a cybersecurity person to be in charge of auditing that and running that, making those decisions? So I see the CISO role being replaced with what are the policies the AI is doing for our business and how it flows and how it works, what apps we're using, what it has access to. The cyber community are the people who should be running that.
So do you recommend then the CISOs take a head-on charge of all the AI initiatives
Yeah.
that are
So
happening?
what I'm saying is if you're a CISO, you should be fighting to run any AI initiative you have in your company, whether it's exploratory, whether it's writing your own stuff. There's a couple friends of mine at large energy companies. They literally are the CISO and the head of AI operations. And that to me is the future. Now, I don't think that it's going to last forever. It's probably going to be AI operations in the long run. It's going to subsume most of the cyber operations. But right now, and if you're not lobbying for that role, you're going to be out of a job because I think your MDR, your MSSP, your vendor is going to replace you.
Interesting. Ron, final topic. Let's talk about the future of cyber offense and cyber defense. This is both near and dear to both of our hearts. You've obviously built companies around this. When I started at Tenable, the time and the cost required to build exploits was hard. We had to learn IDA Pro, reverse engineering, figure out, like, for example, when these new vulnerabilities would come out, we had to spend like time, days to figure out how to exploit this safely and then write an SS signature for it. And now it is possible to write a reasonably working exploit with a prompt. Hey, this is a CV, this is the patch. What's the best way to exploit this? And these models are good enough to go out and give you an exploit. And we are part of, for example, cyber verification program. We can see this firsthand. These models are getting better at crafting the exploits, or not necessarily like, in terms of like weaponizing it, but you can still see how it is going. How can you, if you're a skilled relatively skilled attacker, you can now go from taking a vulnerability information and then going from there. So my question to you is, what is the future of cyber offense? What happens from here? What does the future look like from your point of view? That's the first question. And then the second question is, how do organizations defend against this AI native offense that is coming your way?
Yeah. So look, that's like a whole hour conversation, right? But I can summarize it pretty briefly. So one, look, we might elevate cyber command to cyber force, but if you said, do we have a civilian agency that's already doing offensive cyber? Yeah, it's called the National Security Agency, right? We have another one called the CIA, right? They do a lot of offensive cyber. And do they support cyber command? Do they have the right titles? I mean, absolutely. And for the first time, this administration has publicly acknowledged we're using cyber in these operations, right? Whether it was Venezuela, whether it was the bombing campaign in Iran, we're using cyber. What does that mean? Look, when you do offensive cyber, a lot of people assume it's just like direct hacking and that sort of thing. And maybe there's some of that involved, but the tradecraft could be a lot more interesting, right? Do we have a human in the loop working for us, right? Do we have the ability to deploy something? I mean, there's an article came out yesterday, a parachute can drop a cyber munition and do attacking, right? So a lot of times people don't forget, or they forget that in war, it's the entire triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Maybe we're not hacking in and spying on people. Maybe we're preventing the email from being sent. Maybe we're preventing the email from being sent with jamming, with a physical attack. That's all under cyber command, special operations, and that sort of thing. Are we going to do more of it? Maybe. There's a couple of articles that have come out. I'm doing, again, more research for VRON, where they talk about, look, most of these plans, if you're going to do a cyber attack on a facility, you probably have 6 months, maybe a year to plan for it. And look, if you're doing a bombing campaign, it's very similar, right? We don't just like wake up one day and say, we're going to attack this country. Right? There's plans way ahead of time, and maybe even training, that goes with that. That's how the modern stuff works. But if you want to talk about defense and, what that means in the age of AI, I think it means a couple things. One, I think modern businesses have to realize that cyber hygiene, you need it, but you can't rely on it. If you can't patch fast enough, if your EDR doesn't have a signature for the latest attack, you're going to have bypass. And if you're attacked by a nation state, your layered defenses of controls are not going to prevent them, possibly not even detect them. So what do? I think you have to invest in separate networks, whether it's an air gap network, a cryptographically separated network. But we had the technology to do these things, right? Whether you're a Zscaler shop using Tailscale, like in our portfolio, something called Enclave, can you take your core decision team and have a separate network that is literally separated from the internet, from any content that might come in? Once you think about the internet as any content, whether it's a network connection, a packet, a file, that could be an attack. So if you have the ability to segment that and remove that, you're much better off at being able to defend yourself from China, from Iran, from Russia, or possibly even industrial espionage. So I think these separate air gap networks, these separate cryptographically network is going to be something that people are going to use mostly to keep AI out of things. I want to make sure that none of this data gets to AI. But look, a byproduct of it is you're going to keep China and Russia out. People are going to be more afraid of giving up their corporate data to the AI companies, and they're going to implement these things as air gaps. And the byproduct is China and Russia are going to have a lot harder time hacking into them.
Ron, what you said makes sense for the government, like the NSA. They have been doing offensive security for a long period of time. My question was more targeted towards like the attackers, the ransomware as a service companies. It was very difficult to create exploits to go in and compromise systems. But that equation would change with these AI native tools that would come out. So my question was more targeted towards that. What happens in that scenario? Less about the government.
It's probably going to happen that ransomware is going to increase, but it hasn't yet. As a matter of fact, paying per ransom is going down. The cost of a ransomware event goes up because you have legal, you have to notify your customers, and you have to do understand all the recoveries. So the cost of a ransom is going up. But the actual ransomware actors have had to go into smaller and smaller accounts and those accounts are paying less than normal. And if you look at some of the big ransomware events, like I don't know what Canvas paid to the ransomware actors. I don't know if that's public or not, but there's a lot of big payouts for people who have made mistakes. That skews the ransomware thing higher. But the story there is basically, look, these people who've been hit with ransomware, they got religion, right? So maybe they happen to be CMMC compliant. Maybe they have to be SOC 2 compliant. Maybe it's PCI. Maybe, who knows what it is? Post-ransom victims tend to have a better posture against future attacks going on. But look, I think the whole industry is waiting for like a wave of AI-enabled 0 days and stuff like that. We're not seeing it. There just hasn't been that much of an increase.
What on that topic? What happens to vulnerability discovery and reporting in the age of AI? Like we were used to maybe 100 vulnerabilities a day back in the early days of Tenable, and we would decide to do 5 of them that were like Microsoft or Adobe and so on. The Glasswing update just came out. They said they found 10,000
10,000 vulnerabilities.
critical and
Crazy.
high
Yep.
vulnerabilities in them. They were scanning thousands of open source repos and working with maintainers and so on. Do you sense this happens for the next year or so? There is a massive explosion of vulnerabilities and then it plateaus, or do you think? I think my biggest concern is the chaining of vulnerabilities, not necessarily because typically you would find a remote code execution vulnerability, break into it, compromise the system, and so on. Now you could chain multiple medium severity vulnerabilities, so the attack chains would increase, but the vulnerabilities may come down. I'm curious what you think. Do we see a plateau, or do we see an explosion from here? Things get better or worse from here?
So I think it's going to be difficult. So look, I don't have access to Mythos, but I've talked to companies who've had access to Mythos. And what they're telling me is that, look, they found a bunch of vulnerabilities in their stuff. They're going to fix it, issue patches, and that's a good thing. But if I said, do you think there's more vulnerabilities in there? Of course there's more vulnerabilities in there. We're not done yet. And if Mythos found it with this level, what happens if Mythos 2 comes out and it can find, even more? So when you think about secure by design, I would like to hear more companies saying, you know what, we're going to completely re-architecture our coding to do minimum attack surface stuff. So for example, when you code as just a simple C program, hello world, right? It pulls in a library. Well, that library, might have APIs that your code doesn't need, but it just got linked and it could be exploited. So are there new technologies and new projects out there? And I've been pitched some of these things that have minimum viable attack surface for the libraries you want to include, right? That's a game changer. There's another concept called unikernels out there, right? Instead of having a container that runs on, a container platform, Docker, that kind of stuff. Maybe you could have a VM that just has the APIs that your program needs in the VPN or in the VM. And my point is you're reducing your attack surface to do these things. But when I hear about a company that says, okay, look, our code's pretty ancient. We've got a lot of bad structure here. We're going to completely redo it. And at every step of the way, there's boundary checking, there's variable checking, there's all these things. It's going to be secure by design because if somebody fails along an API, there's going to be all these other checks that stop that. When I hear companies talk about that, I get a lot more confident that we're going to have more secure software. There's no question that we are going to have more secure software because of Mythos and stuff, but are we still going to have more vulnerabilities? Unless we have really well-written programs, we will.
Do you think most of the programming is done with AI in the future because of this?
Well, that's the question. So, I'm on a mailing list or a signal list. I think I can quote it, but Chris Vysopol's on, right? Veracode. And he's like, could you ask Claude to write code that it can't break into, right? That's a good question.
Yeah.
But I've seen code written. I do a lot of shell scripting for what I do for my animation. I see a lot of bad practices every now and then. Every now and then it's sort of like, oh, you're including an API key here. You should have changed that. I'm like, I did change it. Why do you still have access to it? So it's crazy. But the other thing that's going on is people are just hacking GitHub directly. They're making commits, they're doing things. That's a hard one to find. If you look at that copy fail exploit, that was like 3 different things that you had to chain together to get root. I'm working on there's a Linux backdoor story where somebody added if UID equals 0 instead of, it could be 0. And it says it. So there's so many potential attacks with GitHub that we're dependent upon. That's crazy too.
And because of AI, a lot of non-coders or non-programmers are going to be publishing their code to GitHub, and it may or may not be safe. Maybe they expose the environment variable. Who knows? The .env file.
There's like for example, the IoT devices. It used to be that you could never ever on your own replace your firmware, but you could literally say, I bought this device. I'm just going to tell Claude to write code for it that does this, and let me fix it. So that new code might have vulnerabilities, but it's not going to have as many vulnerabilities as that old code. And maybe that code is unique just to your organization. And that's a crazy thing about AI. If I start writing my own SaaS, my own Salesforce CRM, if I start writing my own Gmail, my own stuff like that, maybe it's got more vulnerabilities in there, but if nobody else has it, how does the attacker ever really research it?
Super fascinating, Ron. This has been an amazing interview. I'm grateful for your time. You're way too generous with your time. What's the next big video dropping from Viron?
I have I've got one I'm waiting for Rob Joyce to approve, but Rob Joyce just came out with a paper that basically said that China attacks on our ports and our phone infrastructure. It's the equivalent of like digital dynamite. So he's got a really good, it's like 8 or 9 pages, and I've already recorded it. I'm ready to publish it, but that should be coming out next.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ron. Thank you for coming on Noise to Signal. This has been epic.
Hey, thanks for the great questions. If anybody wants to contact me, and gula.tech is the website, and I'm on LinkedIn. We're pretty active. Find us on YouTube. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this stuff.
And we'll include all that information in the show notes. So that will show up.